On a cold, rainy night, Clint Eastwood walked into a small-town diner, unnoticed by most, except for one struggling waitress. What he left behind? It would change her life forever. Rachel Thompson, a 28-year-old waitress, had never imagined that life would lead her here, working endless late-night shifts at Bessie's Southern Kitchen, a small but well-loved diner in Charleston, South Carolina. Once a hopeful business student, Rachel had been forced to put her education on hold after her fiancé Daniel died in a tragic car accident 2 years ago. The grief had been unbearable, but reality had hit even harder. Between the weight of her student loans and the mounting medical bills for her mother's recent heart surgery, she had no choice but to take any job she could find. That's how she ended up here, waiting tables from dusk till dawn, scraping together enough tips to keep the lights on, and watching her dreams fade into the background. The diner itself had a soul of its own, filled with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and warm biscuits. The soft hum of blues music played from an old jukebox in the corner, blending with the low murmur of conversations from truckers, traveling musicians, and lonely souls looking for a place to belong. The neon, open 24 hours sign flickered outside, casting a soft glow onto the rain-slicked pavement. Inside, the red vinyl booths were worn from years of use, the checkered floors scuffed but spotless thanks to Miss Janice, the diner's elderly owner who treated Rachel like family. Tonight, Rachel was exhausted. She had worked a double shift, barely pausing to sit, yet the thought of going home to another stack of unpaid bills made her stomach twist. She refilled coffee cups, plastered on a practiced smile, and pushed through, just as she always did. As she wiped down the counter, she exhaled, glancing at the door, hoping for a quiet end to her shift. Then the door creaked open. The diner's warm glow spilled onto the sidewalk, illuminating a tall figure in a worn leather jacket and cowboy hat. Rachel looked up, and her breath caught. She knew exactly who had just walked in. The moment the diner's door swung open, Rachel instinctively glanced up from the counter, expecting to see another weary traveler or a group of late-night regulars looking for a hot meal. Instead, a lone figure stepped inside, moving with the kind of quiet confidence that instantly shifted the energy in the room. The dim glow of the overhead lights reflected off his worn leather jacket, and the brim of his cowboy hat cast a subtle shadow over his deeply lined but unmistakable face. Rachel's breath hitched. Even if she hadn't grown up watching old westerns with her father, she would have recognized him anywhere. Clint Eastwood, the legend himself. For a moment, she froze, gripping the coffee pot a little too tightly as a dozen questions raced through her mind. What was he doing here in a tiny Charleston diner at this hour? Of all the upscale places he could be, why this one? The thought barely had time to settle before she caught herself and straightened her shoulders. Celebrity or not, he was a customer, and she had a job to do. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her notepad and walked toward his booth, her heart pounding harder than she cared to admit. He had chosen a corner table, one near the window, where the rain drizzled softly against the glass. As she approached, he lifted his gaze, those sharp steel blue eyes locking onto hers. They weren't intimidating, but they carried a weight, an observant stillness that made her feel like he was seeing right through her. "Good evening, sir," Rachel greeted, somehow managing to keep her voice steady. "What can I get started for you?" Clint glanced at the menu briefly, then set it aside, barely giving it a second look. "Just a coffee, black, and a burger, medium rare. Simple, just like the kind of rolls that made him famous." Rachel scribbled the order down, but before she turned to leave, she hesitated. "Not gonna lie," she said, offering a small smile. "I never thought I'd be serving Clint Eastwood a burger." The faintest smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, and he tipped his hat just slightly. "Life's full of surprises, isn't it?" Rachel nodded, suppressing the urge to say more. Instead, she hurried back toward the kitchen, the reality of this moment sinking in. Something about tonight felt different, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was about to change everything. As Rachel placed Clint Eastwood's order with the cook, she couldn't shake the weight of his presence. Even as she moved between tables, refilling coffee and delivering plates, her thoughts kept drifting back to the quiet man in the corner booth. He wasn't like the few other celebrities she had encountered. No entourage, no flashy demeanor, no attempt to draw attention. Instead, he carried an air of stillness, patience, and something else she couldn't quite name. Every time she glanced his way, he seemed completely at ease, sipping his coffee, staring out the rain-streaked window, lost in thought. When his burger was ready, she grabbed the plate and took a deep breath before walking back over. Carefully setting it in front of him, she gave her usual warm but professional smile. "Here you go, sir. A burger, medium rare, just as ordered." Clint nodded, glancing at the plate. "Appreciate it." He reached for the coffee and took a slow sip before setting the cup down deliberately. Then, before Rachel could walk away, he lifted his gaze. "You been working here long?" The question caught her off guard. Most customers didn't bother with small talk, let alone Clint Eastwood. She shifted her weight, balancing the tray in her hands. A little over 2 years now, she answered. Just until I figured some things out. Clint's eyes studied her for a moment, sharp yet unreadable. Figure what out? Rachel let out a soft chuckle, though there wasn't much humor in it. Oh, you know, she said, trying to sound casual. Life, bills, the whole mess of things, just trying to get by? Clint nodded slightly, as if he understood more than she was saying. He picked up his burger, took a slow, deliberate bite, and chewed thoughtfully before speaking again. You remind me of someone, he said finally, setting the burger down. Rachel frowned slightly. Oh yeah? Someone you know? He exhaled, his expression shifting just a little. Someone I lost a long time ago. She had that same look in her eyes. Rachel felt her breath catch. What look? Clint met her gaze fully now, his voice low but steady. The look of someone carrying more weight than they let on. Someone who keeps pushing forward, even when it feels like the world's pushing back. For a moment, Rachel didn't know what to say. She had never expected this conversation to turn personal, let alone to hear something that resonated so deeply. Her throat tightened, and for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She forced a small smile, trying to brush off the unexpected emotion. Well, life doesn't leave much of a choice, does it? Clint took another sip of his coffee, nodding slightly. No, he said, but the ones who don't back down, they're the ones worth noticing. Rachel swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. As she walked back toward the counter, she had a strange feeling that this conversation wasn't over, and that something about tonight would stay with her forever. Rachel kept herself busy, moving between tables, refilling coffee cups, and delivering orders, but no matter how much she tried to focus on work, she couldn't shake the conversation she just had. Clint's words lingered in her mind like a melody she couldn't forget. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he saw her, that left an unexpected weight in her chest. He didn't pry, didn't ask for details, yet somehow, in just a few sentences, he had summed up exactly how she felt. Like someone carrying more weight than she could handle, but with no choice but to keep going. Occasionally, she stole quick glances at his booth. He ate slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he were in no rush to be anywhere else. Every now and then, he would sip his coffee, his gaze drifting toward the rain tapping gently against the window. Rachel wondered what he was thinking about. Was he remembering the person he had mentioned? The one she apparently reminded him of? Or was he just someone who had learned to sit in silence and let the world move around him? As the night stretched on, the diner began to empty. The usual late-night regulars left one by one, and soon it was only Clint and a few scattered customers finishing their meals. The warm hum of the jukebox filled the quiet space, and Rachel found herself slowing down, almost hesitant for the night to end. Something about this moment felt different, like she was on the edge of something important, though she couldn't quite explain why. Finally, Clint set his cup down, signaling that he was finished. Rachel took a deep breath before walking over, forcing herself to remain composed. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, I think I'm good." Rachel nodded, reaching for his empty plate, but as she did, Clint reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded napkin. He placed it carefully on the table, his fingers tapping at once, almost like a silent acknowledgement. "Read this later," he said simply. Rachel blinked, looking down at the napkin. For a second, she considered asking what it was, but something in the way he said it made her pause. She just nodded. "All right," she said softly. Clint stood, adjusting his jacket. He met her gaze one last time, tipping his hat slightly before turning toward the door. The bell above the entrance jingled softly as he stepped out into the night, disappearing into the rain. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, staring at the napkin on the table. Her heart pounded. Something told her that whatever was inside would change everything. As the last few customers trickled out and the diner quieted, Rachel finally allowed herself to slow down. The rain outside had softened to a gentle drizzle, and the glow of the neon open 24 hours sign reflected against the wet pavement. The only sound inside was the rhythmic clinking of dishes as she wiped down the counter, but her mind was somewhere else, back at that corner booth, back to the moment Clint Eastwood had slid that folded napkin across the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her apron pocket and pulled it out. She hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs. What could it possibly say? Why had he told her to read it later? She swallowed hard, then carefully unfolded the napkin, revealing a neatly written note in strong, deliberate handwriting. "Rachel, people like you don't get enough credit. I see the way you carry yourself. the strength behind your smile. The world doesn't always recognize the quiet fighters, but I do. I lost someone like you once, a woman who never backed down no matter how hard life hit her. She was the best person I ever knew. I don't know your story, but I know you've been fighting battles no one else sees, and I know how heavy that can get. Consider this a small push forward, no strings attached. Use it however you need. You deserve a break. Clint Eastwood. Rachel's breath hitched as she read the words, her vision blurring with tears. She swallowed hard, gripping the note as her chest tightened. No one had ever told her that before. No one had ever looked at her and truly seen her, not like this. She felt something break inside her, something she hadn't even realized she had been holding on to for years. Then something slipped from inside the napkin, a small folded check. Confused, Rachel carefully opened it, her eyes widening as she saw the amount. $25,000. Her breath left her in a sharp gasp. Her hands shook. She had to blink several times, certain she had read it wrong. $25,000? She pressed her palm against her mouth, her entire body trembling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Why would he do this for her? What had he seen in her that made him believe she deserved this? Rachel clutched the note and checked her chest, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. This changed everything. The bills she had been drowning in, her mother's medical debt, the dreams she had abandoned, they were no longer impossible. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Rachel sat in the break room long after the diner had closed, the note and check still clutched tightly in her hands. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the space, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. This wasn't a dream. The money was real. The words Clint had written, they were real. She wiped at her damp cheeks, trying to process the weight of what had just happened. For the first time in years, she wasn't trapped. She had options, choices she had convinced herself were no longer hers to make. By the time she stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the dim glow of the streetlights. She drove home in silence, her mind racing with possibilities. That check was enough to pay off her mother's medical bills, wipe out her overdue rent, and, if she dared to hope, give her the chance to go back to school. Could she finally finish what she started? Could she finally stop just surviving and start building the life she had always wanted? The next morning, Rachel woke up feeling lighter than she had in years. She brewed a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the check once more. This wasn't just money, it was a lifeline. It was someone telling her, without question, that she mattered, that she wasn't invisible. She picked up her phone and dialed the one person who had always believed in her. "Hey, Mom," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I have some good news." Over the next few days, Rachel made changes she had once thought impossible. She paid off every overdue bill that had been haunting her, finally breathing without the weight of financial stress crushing her chest. She enrolled in night classes, ready to finish her business degree and take back the future she had put on hold. And in a quiet act of paying it forward, she left an anonymous donation at the diner, a gift to help another struggling waitress the way Clint had helped her. As the weeks passed, Rachel still found herself thinking about that rainy night, about the man who had walked into her life at exactly the right moment. She never saw Clint Eastwood again, but his kindness stayed with her, shaping her future in ways he would never know. And every time she felt doubt creeping in, she would pull out his note, read his words, and remind herself of one simple truth: she was worth saving. 1 year later, Rachel stood outside Bessie's Southern Kitchen, staring through the glass at the bustling diner that had once felt like her only escape. Tonight, though, she wasn't here to work a double shift or scrape together tips to survive. She was here as a woman who had rebuilt her life, a woman who had finally stepped into the future she had once believed was out of reach. And it had all started with a folded napkin and a name scrawled at the bottom of a note: Clint Eastwood. She had thought about him often over the past year, not just about the money, but about his words, the way he had truly seen her when she had felt invisible to the world. It had been his note, more than the check, that had changed everything. His belief in her had planted a seed of hope, one that had taken root and flourished. Rachel had done more than just pay off her debts. She had finished her business degree, secured a position with a local restaurant group, and started helping struggling small diners manage their finances. No longer trapped in survival mode, she was building something meaningful, not just for herself, but for others who had once stood where she had. As she pushed the door open and stepped inside, the familiar scent of coffee and fried chicken wrapped around her like an old friend. She smiled at the waitress behind the counter, a young woman who reminded her of herself a year ago. Tired, hopeful, and just trying to make it. Reaching into her purse, Rachel pulled out a folded envelope and slid it across the counter. "For the next girl who needs it," she said softly. The waitress frowned, then hesitantly picked it up. "What is this?" Rachel simply smiled, a push forward. As she turned to leave, she glanced toward the booth by the window, the same one Clint had sat in that night. For a moment, she swore she could almost see him there, tipping his hat with that knowing smirk. And just like that, she stepped out into the night, forever changed, forever grateful. Life has a way of making us feel invisible, like we're just pushing through each day, hoping to catch a break. But the truth is, we all deserve to be seen. Rachel's story reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, a few words of encouragement, a simple gesture, can completely change someone's path. You never know what battles people are fighting behind their smiles. And just like Clint Eastwood saw Rachel's strength when she couldn't see it herself, we can choose to recognize and uplift those around us. Maybe that means supporting a friend who's struggling, helping someone in need, or even believing in yourself when no one else does. Life doesn't always hand out second chances, but when an opportunity comes, take it. Whether it's chasing an old dream, breaking free from a cycle of struggle, or finally believing you're worth more than just getting by, you owe it to yourself to step forward. And if you ever doubt your worth, remember this: you are stronger than you know. Your story isn't over, and sometimes the right words at the right time can change everything.